Oberyn Martell stood in the shadow of the Red Keep's towering walls, the stone a forbidding gray against the dying light. Each footstep he took across the courtyard rang hollow in his ears, reminding him of the path he had chosen. A swirl of wind lifted the hem of his cloak. He paused, inhaling the salt-tinged air blowing in from Blackwater Bay, his mind churning with all the reasons he should never have set foot here. Yet here he was, by his own arrangement and the agreement of men too powerful to deny. Already he felt the city's eyes on him, the spymaster's whispers, the Lannisters' glances, the Stark wards, even the Goldcloaks passing in the yard. It had been decided. He would marry Cersei Lannister, and his heart smoldered with the memory of his sister's fate. There were no illusions in his mind about where this union would lead him. He had faced swordsmen whose skill approached his own. He had gambled fortunes in lands far beyond the narrow sea, but none of that could compare to the danger that lurked beneath the Red Keep's facade. His presence here was no mere courtesy visit. Doran, his elder brother, had warned him not to let hatred blind him. Yet for Oberyn, his rage had become the sharpest of blades, a honed weapon he would thrust at the Lannisters when the time was right. He had not come to King's Landing to befriend them. He had come to avenge Elia, who deserved more than any empty vow of justice from a crown that had cast her aside. The sun dipped past the high battlements, washing the courtyard in a deepening twilight. Servants hurried inside to light the torches, and Oberyn forced his stride to remain calm, unhurried, as though he were a guest in the finest palace in Dorne rather than the lair of those he held responsible for Elia's murder. The wedding would be in a fortnight. The banns had already been announced. He would bind himself to Tywin Lannister's daughter, Robert Baratheon's queen consort no longer, for the negotiations had shifted drastically in the recent months, and as Oberyn's footfalls echoed on the stone, he recalled the swirl of rumor. Robert's betrothal undone, or perhaps redirected, maybe a rift had grown between Tywin and the new king. The details were complicated, shifting by the day. All that mattered was that Tywin had offered Cersei to House Martell, presumably to keep Dorne in the fold and quell the simmering tensions. And Oberyn, known for his cunning and willingness to play the most dangerous games, had stepped forward. Everyone suspected cunning, but no one could see all the edges of his blade. He reached the main door and nodded at the guards without a word. Inside, the Red Keep's corridors stretched out like the labyrinth of some ancient monster, each turn capable of swallowing the unwary. Light flickered from sconces on the walls, the flames casting lively patterns on the shining floor. Oberyn's eyes darted over the tapestry that depicted a legendary battle of House Targaryen, the woven dragons shimmering in red and black. The realm had been turned upside down since Robert's rebellion, and those dragons were near extinct, the Targaryen line in exile or dead, leaving only new usurpers and those who had seized the moment to enthrone themselves. Oberyn found it a bitter irony that the man who had claimed the Iron Throne now had a close alliance with the very house that had orchestrated the sack of King's Landing, the violation of Elia, her children dashed to pieces. Beneath that tapestry, and beneath every polished corner, Oberyn saw only ghosts of the past. His boots clicked on the floor, a crisp echo that made him remember the first time he had come here as a boy. He had been too young to fight in the war, but not too young to bristle at the humiliations Dorne had borne. Prince Rhaegar had wed Elia, and she had borne him children. A bond of blood had been forged between the Martells and the Targaryens. Then the war came, and Tywin Lannister's men had broken into the city. Oberyn knew all the lurid details in his nightmares. For years, he had tried to push away the images of how they ended her life. Now he would walk in their midst, smiling, charming, waiting, the viper among the Lannisters. A servant scurried ahead, hair plastered to her forehead by sweat and nerves. "My Lord Oberyn, Princess? Or shall I call you Prince? We're prepared to show you your chambers, if you'll follow me." He noticed her eyes flicker to his curved dagger, the hilt shaped like a serpent. He gave a nod with no warmth behind it, and let her guide him along a narrower corridor. The hush of the Red Keep's interior was oppressive, as though the walls themselves were eavesdropping. On the morrow, he would greet the courtiers with a grin, pay homage to the king, and bend a knee before the hand that had orchestrated this wedding. He felt the weight of Doran's caution on his shoulders. Be patient. Do not let them see the rancor in your eyes. Wait for the right moment. But each step filled him with a roiling desire to shatter something. He forced himself to breathe slowly and think of the desert. Dry, calm, silent. The dunes never betrayed their secrets easily. When he was finally left alone in the suite of rooms assigned to him, he shut the door and took stock of the place. It was sumptuous enough, with a broad bed draped in crimson cloth and a polished table set by the balcony. An open arch led to a second room for his personal guard or attendants. A set of tall windows framed the city below, their glass tinted with subtle color. He heard the distant horns that signaled the changing of the city watch. The air here smelled so different from Sunspear's warm breezes. He walked to the window, parted the heavy curtains, and gazed down at King's Landing. The city sprawled outward, a labyrinth of hovels and markets, the far-off shapes of ships rocking in the harbor. It looked almost peaceful from up here, but he knew better. King's Landing was a nest of vipers in its own right. Perhaps that was fitting. He let a small smile lift the corner of his mouth and gently tapped his fingers on the windowsill, counting. Some old habit or pattern his mind played at. He forced himself away from the view and turned to examine a painting that hung on the wall, a scene of some long-dead Lannister figure in glorious gold armor. The pride of that family exuded even from the painted strokes. Oberyn studied the line of the subject's chin, noticing the haughty tilt of the head. So characteristic, he mused. Then, with a faint twist of his lips, he wondered if Tywin had installed that painting here specifically to watch him as he slept. But Oberyn was never one to be cowed by watchful eyes. Let them watch. He had come here willingly, and he would be the serpent in the lion's den. His first meeting with his betrothed was arranged for that evening in a smaller solar, a more private setting that would let them exchange courtesy and perhaps speak a little of the wedding preparations. Oberyn looked at himself in the mirror, brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his doublet, a deep burgundy that set off his sun-darkened skin, and then stepped out. He found his escort waiting outside, 2 Lannister guardsmen with gleaming lion sigils on their surcoats. They inclined their heads stiffly and led him through the labyrinth of hallways. He made note of each turn, the location of the windows, which corridors seemed guarded, which seemed disused. Over the course of years, Oberyn had honed his observational skills as keenly as his weapons. Doran would have expected nothing less. Finally, the guards brought him to a corridor that ended in a pair of oaken doors. One guard rapped upon them and then ushered him in. Cersei Lannister was perched on a high-backed chair near a small table set with a decanter of wine and 2 cups. Her hair glinted gold in the torchlight. She was still clad in mourning black for some distant relative, or so rumor had it, but the cloth was cut in a fashion that did not suggest much sorrow. Her eyes, a cool emerald color, took his measure in an instant. He could almost feel her gaze flick over his face, his shoulders, noting the angle of his hips and the length of his legs, as if assessing a piece of merchandise. He bowed, and she inclined her head. "Prince Oberyn," she greeted. He heard the faintest emphasis on the word prince, as though she couldn't quite keep the dryness from her tone. "My Lady Cersei," he replied, taking her hand. He kissed it, his lips just grazing the skin. There was no warmth between them. The air felt like a sheet of ice. She beckoned him to sit. The gold thread that edged her gown shimmered with each movement. He recalled that once, not so many years ago, Cersei had been betrothed to Prince Rhaegar. That never came to pass, replaced by Elia, his sister. He wondered how much resentment lingered behind Cersei's eyes for that slight. Perhaps it had made Elia's murder easier for her father to justify. Perhaps not. But Oberyn had a lifetime of practice reading faces. Cersei's was a mask, lovely and impervious, but he could glean her scorn for this arrangement even in the small lines around her eyes. She poured wine into the 2 cups and motioned for him to take one. "Let us drink to our union. May it bring our families closer." He raised the cup, feeling the swirl of crimson liquid inside. He knew how easily poison could slip into a glass. But here, in the Red Keep, It would be foolish for the Lannisters to attempt something so obvious. He took a small sip. The wine was robust, well-aged. To our union, indeed. May it bring prosperity to all in the 7 kingdoms. Cersei gave him a thin smile. House Martell and House Lannister. Who would have guessed we would come to this? After all the ill will between us. Who indeed? He murmured, letting his gaze roam over the solar. A pair of golden lions stood carved on the mantel, their teeth bared. He could sense the tension in the room, as though each was waiting for the other to slip up. Yet we both are wise enough to see the advantage. The realm has endured too many wars. Perhaps a union such as ours will help quell any further strife. It is the will of your Lord Father, and my brother, that we do this. Her eyes flashed. Yes, my father's will. He is nothing if not pragmatic. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Oberyn let his thoughts wander to the ballads and songs that would be composed about this wedding. He imagined the minstrels singing bright tunes, praising the union that spanned from the hot deserts of Dorne to the proud ramparts of the Rock. The audience would clap and nod, never knowing the undercurrents that ran beneath each vow. He sipped more wine and decided to see if Cersei would reveal a hint of her true feelings. I have heard it said, he began, that you are the most beautiful woman in Westeros. I see no reason to doubt it. She allowed a hollow laugh. I have heard such words, but flattery seldom moves me, Prince Oberyn. Besides, a woman's beauty is only one of her weapons. Indeed, he said softly. And how do you prefer to wield that weapon? She stared back, clearly evaluating him, but then let her mouth relax into a demure curve that fooled no one. Carefully, she said, the same way I handle any sword pointed in my direction. He lifted his cup in acknowledgement and let the silence return. They were each playing a game, the pieces shifting almost imperceptibly. She wanted something from this union too, or at least Tywin did. Possibly a new alliance that gave Lannister hold on Dorne, ensuring that House Martell could not rise in revolt. For a moment, Oberyn felt a pang at the memory of how drastically things had changed since Rhaegar. Elia's children had died, and so had House Targaryen's hold. Now the monarchy was a patchwork of alliances and marriages, tenuous as a spider's web. He forced a pleasant smile onto his face. I see there is wine enough, he said, setting his cup down. But might I request a chance to walk with you in the gardens tomorrow? If we are to wed, we should at least share a moment of conversation beyond these walls. She studied him for a beat, then nodded. Very well, at midday. The royal gardens by the cliff. Not the main courtyard. I prefer something more private. Her tone suggested she would prefer to avoid being seen with him too often. He bowed. Tomorrow, then. The conversation lurched to a more perfunctory exchange of wedding details, whether the ceremony would take place in the sept or the courtyard, which lords and ladies had already arrived, the color of the draperies. Oberyn offered a mild suggestion or two, but mostly let Cersei make the decisions. He played the role of an accommodating consort, letting her fill the silence with trivial plans. Yet beneath the surface, his mind raced. Each drapery, each vantage point, each guest who might attend, he was cataloging them as potential pieces in a future confrontation. He did not plan to wait idly for vengeance to find him. When at last the meeting concluded, he bowed again and took his leave. The corridor seemed colder now. As the guards escorted him back to his chambers, he mulled over the first impression Cersei had made. She was not timid, and though her father's shadow loomed over everything, she possessed her own cunning. He sensed a bitterness in her that matched his own. What shape that bitterness might take was yet to be seen. He wondered if, in another life, they might have formed an alliance of equals. But the gulf of blood between them was vast. He whispered Elia's name under his breath as he made his way to his bed. He would not forget. The night passed fitfully, and at dawn, he rose and practiced his usual sword drills. The rhythmic clash of steel against air calmed him, focusing his mind on the control he must maintain. By the time the sun had fully climbed above the city, his limbs glistened with sweat, and he felt the comforting burn in his muscles. One of his personal guardsmen brought him a fresh change of clothes. A light silk tunic in burnt orange, with golden thread embroidered along the sleeves. Oberyn took it without comment, though he recognized that the color would stand out against the drab stone of the castle. He wanted them to see the brightness of Dorne in him, to remember that their crimes had not been forgotten. A short time later, he arrived at the gardens that overlooked the sea. A waist-high wall of pale stone marked the edge, where one could peer down into the crashing waves against the cliff face below. A long path meandered through topiary hedges and patches of fragrant flowers. The morning sun warmed the greenery, and the occasional gull swooped overhead, crying into the wind. Oberyn glanced around, noting the presence of 2 Lannister guards near an archway. He ignored them, strolling on until he spotted Cersei near a flowering trellis. Today she wore a gown the color of new leaves, her golden hair pinned up, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. She faced away from him, apparently studying the blossoms, though he doubted she truly cared about them. He slowed his steps, adjusting his approach so she could hear him coming, but she did not turn. Only when he stood at her shoulder, close enough to sense her perfume, did she speak. "You're late," she said without looking. He noted the faintly accusing lilt. "Am I?" he replied with a shrug. "My apologies, my lady. The bells told me I was on time." She exhaled in a way that suggested impatience, then pivoted to face him. She had a rather perfect face, symmetrical and refined, but to him it was like a beautiful shield, designed to fascinate, yet hide everything behind it. She gestured to the path. "Shall we walk?" They moved side by side along the crushed gravel. A mild breeze stirred the leaves. Oberyn noticed how the sun glimmered in her hair, turning each strand into something like spun gold. He remembered hearing rumors that she had once tried to catch the eye of Rhaegar Targaryen, that her father had wanted that match before he offered up Elia. He wondered if a trace of envy lurked in her still, or if she simply held animosity for House Martell as a matter of principle. He decided to see if he could tease out more. "The city is quiet today," he ventured, glancing up at the gull that circled overhead. "No rumor of fighting in the streets or riots at the gates." She gave him a sidelong look. "Not every day is a riot here, Prince Oberyn." "Of course not." He paused. "But the memory of war lingers, does it not? The city still remembers the sack. I was here, though only just." She kept her eyes forward, posture stiffening. "I recall. My father saw to the city's transition of power." He sensed the tension in her words, the recognition of that time's horrors. They walked on a few steps, and he heard the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. "I suppose no city can fully recover from such violence," he continued. "The ghosts linger." Cersei stopped suddenly, her hand catching his arm. "Why do you speak of ghosts?" she asked, her voice low but intense. "The war is over. The realm must move forward. And you and I, this marriage will help unify our houses. Are you determined to look backward?" His heart thudded once, a strong pulse of anger. He wanted to snap that he had every right to look backward, but he forced a pleasant expression. "Forgive me. Dorne has a long memory. Perhaps I should be more forward-looking, as you say." He allowed his arm to brush against her hand, the gesture suggestive of closeness. "After all, we are to wed. Our fates are entwined now." She released him and started walking again. "Yes, they are," she said. "If you wish to speak of the future, then let us speak of what you hope to gain here, truly. I am not naive. My father arranged this match. King Robert sanctioned it. My brother Jaime is absent on royal business. I find myself caged in these walls, expected to marry a man from the south. Tell me, do you dream of placing a Martell on the Iron Throne one day?" He let out a short laugh. "Now who is looking backward, my lady? We both know that after Robert's rebellion, the Iron Throne is no longer in Targaryen hands. I have no illusions about seats of power. I am, however, quite protective of my family's interests. If an alliance with House Lannister strengthens Dorne, so be it." She cast him a sharp glance, then turned away, as though scanning the horizon. "You are cunning," she admitted, "but do not assume that cunning alone can outsmart my father. He sees far. He has plans that reach beyond anything you or I might guess." Oberyn made a noncommittal hum. "I respect Lord Tywin's intellect, as I respect the intelligence of his daughter." Her lips curved slightly, whether from flattery or from acknowledging a challenge. They continued down the path in silence for a while, passing a rose bush in full bloom. A group of small birds scattered from a nearby fountain as they approached. He realized how easy it would be to slip a dagger into her side here, or to fling her over the wall into the sea. The thought was fleeting but stark. He was not so rash as that, of course, but the anger within him seethed, demanding atonement. He forced his mind to the discipline he had learned in his travels, the calm that preceded any lethal strike. Patience. He paused at the edge of the wall that overlooked the ocean, leaning on it with both arms. The wind teased his hair, carrying with it the faint, briny scent of the water below. Cersei joined him, though she kept a careful distance, as though uncertain what to make of him. He looked out across the bay, taking in the tall masts of ships in the harbor. "A lovely view," he commented. "One can almost forget the law. Byrinth of the city behind us." She nodded, her gaze on the horizon. "I come here sometimes to escape the castle. My father thinks it frivolous to stand about staring at the sea, but I like to be alone, away from so many prying eyes. And the sound of the waves." She trailed off, then stiffened, as though catching herself offering something personal. Oberyn filed away that snippet of vulnerability. He might need it later. "I can understand," he said gently. "Dorne has its own music. The whisper of sand against stone, the flutter of desert blooms beneath the scorching sun. Sometimes I go to the dunes simply to taste the silence. It reminds me of, well, a time before certain memories took hold." She glanced at him. "You speak of your sister, don't you?" He turned, unsettled by her directness. Her face was still impassive, but she must have known how raw that wound was. He forced a thin smile. "Yes, I lost her to violence I still cannot fully comprehend." For an instant, he thought he saw a flicker of remorse in her expression, but it might have been only the shifting light. Then her mouth settled into its usual firmness. "War spares no one. We have all lost someone." She straightened and moved away from the wall, brushing her gown's skirt with a practiced hand. "We should return. The day is growing hot, and I have matters to attend to for the wedding feast. I assume you will want Dornish dishes served among the courses." "Indeed," he replied, letting the moment pass. "That would please me." She inclined her head and led him away from the edge, back toward the Red Keep's halls. As they walked, Oberyn mused on their exchange. There had been a flash of something almost human in Cersei, some corner of her that had felt grief. Or perhaps it was all an act. Either way, he could feel the tension weaving between them, heavy as iron chains. In a fortnight, that tension would be sealed with vows at the altar, a grand spectacle of politics disguised as romance. He wondered which of them was better at lying. The next days slipped by in a blur of preparations. Oberyn endured numerous fittings for wedding attire that he cared little about. He attended courtiers' feasts, letting them fawn over him, praising Dorne's fabled hospitality and spices. He visited the training yard to observe the knights drilling, occasionally stepping in to showcase a flicker of his own skill with the spear or rapier, if only to remind everyone that he was not to be trifled with. Everywhere he went, he felt the persistent eyes of the king's spymaster, Varys, the master of whisperers, a plump man with soft hands and a cunning smile. Varys would glide up to him at unexpected moments, offering little compliments or half-warnings about the city's intrigues. Oberyn gave him polite nods, aware that the eunuch was as dangerous as any swordsman. The entire castle reeked of secrets. On the eve of the wedding, there was a feast in the Great Hall, with lords and ladies from across the realm in attendance. Oberyn caught glimpses of the Baratheons, Stannis, stone-faced as always, and Renly, younger and more prone to flamboyant laughter. Though the king himself was off on a hunt, apparently less interested in the ceremony. Tywin Lannister was present, of course, austere in a doublet of red and gold, his pale green eyes dissecting every conversation from across the room. Oberyn greeted him with a bow, and Tywin's own bow in return was so slight it might have been a courtesy only because others were watching. They exchanged a few words about the wedding's significance. Oberyn kept his face neutral, though his heart hammered as he stood near the man he believed orchestrated his sister's demise. This was the crux of his plan, winning Tywin's trust or at least his acquiescence so that one day Oberyn could strike. But that day was not this one. Cersei was radiant, wearing a deep crimson gown embroidered with golden lions. Her hair was piled high, gleaming in the many candles that lit the hall. She spoke with the other highborn ladies, occasionally letting her gaze stray to Oberyn, a polite smile pinned to her lips. The dance of courtesy was unrelenting. Servants bustled about, refilling goblets of wine, presenting trays of roasted game, sweet pastries shaped like flowers, and spiced delicacies from the reach. Musicians played lively tunes on their lutes and flutes, though Oberyn could not fully embrace the merriment. He felt too aware of the web around him, each silk thread leading back to a shadowed corner in Tywin Lannister's mind. Late into the evening, Oberyn slipped away from the crowd, weaving past drunken lords. He found the open door to a terrace overlooking the city. The music grew muffled behind him, and the cool night air brushed his face like a balm. He placed his hands on the balustrade, looking out at the expanse of King's Landing, scattered with torchlight and lanterns like fallen stars. His mind churned with memories of the day the city fell to the rebels, of Elia cowering in the Red Keep, helpless. He clenched his jaw. The vow he had made to avenge her was more than a passing fancy. It was the center of his life, and tomorrow, he would bind himself to one of the very snakes who had been coiled around the throne, constricting it until Elia's children were crushed. He exhaled a ragged breath. The shuffle of footsteps behind him made him straighten. He glanced over his shoulder, prepared to greet another courtier or perhaps Varys. Instead, he found himself face to face with Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf brother. Tyrion bowed with surprising grace, then came up to the terrace rail, stepping onto a small stool placed there so he could see over it. He gave Oberyn a wry grin. "Enjoying the night air, my lord?" Tyrion asked, swirling the contents of his wine goblet. "I am," Oberyn replied, regarding the dwarf with curiosity. Tyrion was rumored to be clever, well-read, and not entirely comfortable in the role his family demanded of him. Oberyn had once heard him referred to as the only Lannister who might occasionally show a conscience. "It's calmer out here than in there." Tyrion sipped his wine. I agree. Though I must say, you're either very brave or very foolish to marry my sister. Possibly both." Oberyn narrowed his eyes slightly. "It's not often I hear a brother speak so plainly about his sister." Tyrion shrugged. "Cersei is complicated, as is my father, as is everything in this family." He paused, and his mismatched eyes flicked briefly to Oberyn's face. "You have your reasons, of course. I doubt they all revolve around joy and romance." Oberyn let out a faint chuckle. "I suppose you'd say that. Tell me, does the imp speak for House Lannister now?" Tyrion snorted. "Hardly. I speak only for myself. But I know enough to guess that House Martell is not doing this out of love. And I know you lost someone dear." The mention of Elia was implicit in his tone. Oberyn straightened, unsettled by how easily Tyrion acknowledged it. Still, he forced composure. "Losing those you love in war is common," he said carefully. "I hold no illusions about who is to blame. But if the wedding can bring peace, then so be it. I doubt you believe in such noble aims, though." Tyrion turned his gaze to the city lights. "I believe that the realm could use less bloodshed, certainly. But I also believe in the inevitability of ambition and vengeance. They're the twin pillars that hold up the entire structure of this monarchy. Nonetheless, I wish you well, Prince Oberyn. Sincerely, this family is not an easy one to be tied to." Oberyn studied the dwarf's face. "Thank you," he said at last, with a measured nod. Your candor is refreshing. Tyrion finished his wine and glanced back at the glow from the feast behind them. And now I should return before my absence is noted. Enjoy the night while it lasts. Tomorrow you become my brother by law. With that, he left, his footsteps tapping lightly on the floor. Oberyn remained there, gazing at the city, thinking on Tyrion's words. The inevitability of ambition and vengeance. Yes, it was inevitable, at least for Oberyn. The question was whether he would survive long enough to see it through. He pressed his palms into the stone and closed his eyes, recalling Elia's face, Rhaenys' laughter, baby Aegon in her arms, the crack of a door bursting open, the shrieks. He would not rest until the ones truly responsible were called to account. The wedding day dawned bright and cloudless, as though mocking the undercurrents that swirled beneath the festivities. By midday, the great September of Baelor was filled with high lords, ladies, and knights, all dressed in their finest attire. Stained glass windows threw shards of colored light across the marble floor. The septons and septas filed in solemnly, chanting prayers to the seven, while courtiers rustled in the pews, whispering the latest gossip. Oberyn stood near the altar, clad in robes of shimmering gold and orange, the sigil of House Martell embroidered at his breast. He could feel the gazes of the assembled watchers, some curious, others skeptical, still others quietly resentful or suspicious. He kept his face composed, though his veins thrummed with tension. This was the day he would chain himself to Cersei Lannister, a day he had once imagined only in nightmares. He reminded himself of the bigger game, the end goal. House Martell would be closer to the seat of power. The chance for vengeance would come. He glanced at the front row, where Tywin Lannister sat, austere and imposing. Tyrion was beside him, expression politely neutral. On another bench sat Doran Martell, who had arrived just the day before, flanked by his retinue. Doran's face was unreadable, though Oberyn thought he detected the slightest tremor in his brother's hands from the long journey. They locked eyes. Oberyn gave him a nod, acknowledging the vow they shared. Then the herald trumpeted, and Cersei appeared in the doorway, framed by golden light. She walked slowly down the aisle, her gown a marvel of crimson and gold thread, a diadem of rubies woven into her hair. She looked every inch the proud Lannister princess, the flicker of an unreadable smile on her lips. Her eyes scanned the crowd with regal poise until she reached Oberyn at the altar. Her expression did not soften. A hush fell among the gathered nobles. The High Septon intoned the ancient words, calling on the father, the mother, the warrior, and all the rest to bless this union. Oberyn's pulse hammered. He reached for her hands. Hers were cool, steady. If she was nervous, she did not show it. They repeated the vows as tradition demanded, pledging to be man and wife, to join House Martell and House Lannister in peace. The final vow tasted bitter on Oberyn's tongue, but he spoke it firmly. "You may cloak the bride," the Septon declared. Oberyn took the cloak bearing the sun and spear sigil of House Martell, draped it over her shoulders, symbolizing her passing from her father's house to his. She stood perfectly still, letting him fasten it. Then the Septon bade them join hands once more. The crowd's hush seemed to intensify. Oberyn inhaled. This was it, the binding contract. The Septon pronounced them man and wife, a union recognized by the seven themselves. The applause was measured, polite, and Oberyn felt the subtle shift in the air, as though the realm itself were holding its breath. He leaned forward and kissed Cersei lightly. Her lips were a mere touch, neither inviting nor cold. It was as if she offered only what was required and nothing more. The recessional was a blur. Lords cheering, musicians striking a triumphant chord, flower petals strewn at their feet as they left the sept. Outside, the city roared with the noise of celebration. For a royal wedding was always cause for festivities, no matter how the bride and groom felt. Tents had been set up in the courtyard of the Red Keep, overflowing with ale, wine, and roasted meats. Jugglers and fire-eaters performed for the crowds, who thronged to catch a glimpse of the new princess from Dorne and the lioness of House Lannister made into a Dornish bride. Oberyn forced a smile and played the role of the gallant prince, offering Cersei his arm, guiding her through the throng. She never faltered, returning the greetings with a poised tilt of her head, her mouth curved in a polite smile that never reached her eyes. Inside the castle walls, a private wedding feast had been arranged for the nobility, with courses that spanned the entire known world's culinary delights. Doran Martell was seated near Tywin Lannister at the high table, a symbol of unity between the houses. Oberyn and Cersei were placed at the center, the pivot around which all attention revolved. Servants bustled, refilling wine, laying out platters of spiced goat, lemon cakes, stuffed grape leaves, honeyed locusts imported from Essos. The chatter grew as lords raised toasts to the new marriage. Oberyn drank sparingly. Cersei, he noticed, drank more. At one point, when the music began and dancers whirled in the center of the hall, Oberyn leaned toward his new wife. "Shall we indulge them by dancing, my lady?" he said, forcing a note of lightness in his voice. She flicked her gaze at him, her eyes already a touch glazed from wine. "If it will please the guests." "Come, then." They rose, and the dancers made room for them. The musicians struck a lively tune, but Oberyn guided her in a more subdued dance, aware that half the nobles in the hall were watching their every move. Her hand in his felt tense, her posture rigid. Yet they circled gracefully, as if trained for the stage. He forced a charming smile, and she mirrored it, both of them playing the part of a contented couple. In truth, Oberyn wanted to be anywhere else. He wanted to be in the training yard with his spear, or riding through the Dornish desert with the sun burning overhead. But he moved in rhythm, ignoring the swirl of bright gowns and the pungent mix of perfumes. When the dance ended, she broke away from him at once, returning to the table. The night wore on, and eventually, the feast ended in a flourish. The crowd roared with body suggestions about the bedding ceremony, a Westerosi tradition Oberyn found distasteful. Nonetheless, the lords insisted. There was laughter and catcalls as the men-at-arms made to carry Cersei to the bridal chamber, the ladies pulling Oberyn in the other direction to strip him. He endured it with stoic amusement. He could see the fury in Cersei's eyes, but she allowed herself to be borne away, the shreds of her gown fluttering in the hands of the drunken courtiers. Finally, the men tossed Oberyn, stripped to his small clothes, onto the bed in the chamber, and the door slammed behind them, leaving him alone with Cersei. The sudden silence was jarring. The bedchamber was lit by a single tall candelabrum near the door. Cersei stood on the opposite side of the bed, half draped in a thin shift, her hair in disarray. Her cheeks were flushed with anger. Oberyn could see that she hated this part of the ceremony, the humiliation. For a moment, they stared at each other across the rumpled bedclothes, newly bound by vows, yet separated by an ocean of mistrust. Oberyn approached her slowly, reaching for the robe left on a chair. He held it out. She did not move. "I can kill them all someday," she said quietly, as though it were a vow to herself. "The ones who think they can humiliate a queen." His brows lifted. "You may, though you are no longer queen in truth. It was your father's arrangement that ended that betrothal." Her mouth twisted. "Yet I remain queen in my own mind. No one will strip me of that. They will regret this farce tonight." He set the robe around her shoulders. The hush pressed in. Then, gently, he ran his palm over her upper arm. She stiffened, but did not pull away. "They do not matter now," he said. "All that matters is you and I. Let us play our roles well, so that we can each have what we want from this union." He let his hand fall away and stepped back, giving her space. "I will not force you tonight or any night. I do not relish that kind of power." She shot him a hard glance. "You think I need your pity, Martell? I think you have endured enough humiliations in your life," he said, voice low. "As have I." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw the conflicting emotions swirling in her face. Finally, she sank onto the bed, pulling the robe tighter around herself. She did not speak for a time, and Oberyn stood near the candelabrum, arms folded. The air was thick with tension and unspent rage. Outside, faintly, They could hear the lingering revelers chanting and laughing in the corridors. But no one dared to enter now. The bedding was done, and they were man and wife. Cersei exhaled. "You said you do not relish that kind of power. Then what do you want from me?" He let the question hang in the air. It was a question he could not answer truthfully without incriminating himself. Yet he chose words carefully. "I want House Martell to stand strong and hold its rightful place in the realm," he said. "If you will help me achieve that, I will help you achieve what you want, whatever that might be." She tilted her head, her hair brushing her cheeks. "And if what I want is not so simple?" He allowed a small smile. "Nothing in King's Landing is ever simple, my lady." He moved closer, slowly, until he was near enough to feel her breath. "Tonight, let us simply survive. In the morning, we can consider what shape this alliance might take." She studied his face, then gave a slow nod. "Survive." Her tone was edged with bitterness, but she did not flinch away. "Very well." He turned, took up a blanket, and spread it on the floor beside the bed. She watched him without comment as he arranged a makeshift pallet. He caught her eyes, felt the surprise in them. "I told you," he murmured. "I will not force anything tonight. Sleep in the bed. I will not disturb you." She hesitated, then let out a breath, as though releasing the tension that had gripped her spine. "If that is your wish." She lay back on the bed, pulling the covers over herself, her eyes still open, still wary. Oberyn settled onto the blanket on the floor, propping his head on a rolled cloak. His entire body was taut, and he knew sleep would be a long time coming. Through the open window, the moonlight spilled across the floor, and beyond it, the city's restless energy ebbed and flowed like a distant tide. Eventually, the noise outside died away, replaced by the soft hush of night. Oberyn stared at the ceiling, remembering the flicker of Elia's smile, the ring of her laughter when they played as children. He closed his eyes and thought of how she had trusted the realm's promises, how the gods had failed her. A quiet vow pulsed in his heart. He would use whatever power and position he could wrest from this marriage. He would bide his time, feign contentment, gather the secrets he needed. And one day, he would see Tywin Lannister pay for Elia's blood. One day, the debt would come due. He heard Cersei shift on the bed, a faint rustle of linen. Perhaps she, too, lay awake, haunted by her own demons. He did not speak to her again that night. Dawn came slowly, the sky paling in the window, bringing with it the reality of his new life. The Red Keep, his new bride, the vow that bound them even as their hearts raged apart. With a groan, he rose from the floor, shaking out his cramped limbs. He crossed to the window, feeling the first rays of sunlight brush his face. Behind him, he heard Cersei stir. In the days that followed, they maintained a careful facade. They sat together at court functions, her hand on his arm, exchanging polite pleasantries for all to see. But Ey spent their nights apart, unless demanded by their public roles. The rumor mill in King's Landing churned. Some said the marriage was already loveless. Others claimed they saw genuine warmth growing between the Serpent of Dorne and the Lioness of the Rock. Both stories were false in their extremes, but Oberyn encouraged neither. Let them gossip. He busied himself with exploration of the Red Keep's deeper corridors, forging connections with the few men and women who were open to bribes or conversation. He dined with Tyrion Lannister more than once, finding the dwarf's wit at least tolerable compared to the rest of the family. Tywin remained a cold presence, seldom addressing Oberyn except when necessary. Doran soon departed back to Dorne, leaving Oberyn to navigate the capital alone. The days blurred into weeks. Oberyn maintained his facade, but each evening in the hush of his private room, he considered how best to strike at the heart of those who had wronged Elia. Cersei, for her part, guarded her own secrets. She would retire to her chambers with only her ladies in waiting, or sometimes vanish for hours on some errand. If Oberyn inquired, she would respond with a cool arch of her brow, reminding him that her life did not revolve around him. Sometimes, though, they found themselves in the gardens, walking side by side in cautious conversation. He discovered flashes of intelligence behind her guarded remarks, a thirst for influence. He could see how the court had shaped her, how her father's ruthless example had imprinted on her. But there remained a deep well of anger beneath that polished surface, an anger not unlike his own. It was one such afternoon, as they strolled near the orchard of figs in the castle's outer courtyard, that Cersei spoke of rumors swirling in the city, that there was a Targaryen child rumored to have survived across the sea. Oberyn listened, concealing his interest. He had heard such rumors in the free cities, that Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen lived in exile. Sometimes the rumor said another child of Rhaegar lived. He wondered if Cersei viewed this as a threat to her father's hold on the realm. The conversation drifted, and she returned to speaking of more immediate concerns. The king's hunts, the alliances in the Vale, the rising cost of bread in King's Landing. Oberyn took note of it all quietly. Their marriage remained unconsummated in truth for weeks, unheard of for a union so politically important. He suspected Tywin was displeased. But Oberyn had no intention of fathering a child with a woman he neither trusted nor loved, at least not yet. He did not relish the idea of bringing a child into this quagmire. Still, the pressure from the court to produce an heir grew louder. Whispers circulated that the marriage was a sham. Tywin summoned Oberyn to a private audience, confronting him in the stony calm that was his trademark. "Your union must bear fruit," Tywin said flatly, his cold eyes boring into Oberyn's. "Do not think me ignorant of your refusal to share my daughter's bed." Oberyn merely smiled thinly. "My lord, with all respect, these things take time. We are learning to trust each other." Tywin's jaw tightened. "Trust is irrelevant. Duty is what matters. You will do your duty." Oberyn inclined his head, hiding the fury that rose in him at Tywin's commanding tone. "Of course, Lord Tywin. I hear you clearly." In the corridor outside that meeting, Oberyn's blood pounded in his ears. He wanted to draw his dagger and put an end to Tywin's smug arrogance. But that would be too rash, too quickly ended. And it would not resurrect Elia. He reminded himself of his vow, patience. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the memory of her voice fill him with resolve. Then, exhaling sharply, he opened them again and walked away. That night, Oberyn found himself standing at Cersei's chamber door. The hallway was dimly lit by a single torch, the shadows flickering on the stones. He hesitated, then knocked once. After a moment, her voice came from within, low and tense. "Enter." He slipped inside. She stood by the window, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a dressing gown of pale green. Her expression was guarded, a slight flush on her cheeks. He shut the door behind him. The fire in the hearth cast long shadows across the bed, and the faint perfume of roses lingered in the air. "What do you want?" she asked, her arms crossing over her chest. He stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. "Your father made it very clear that he expects an heir." She let out a dry laugh. "My father, always with his demands. And you? Do you want a child to secure your hold on Dorne?" He exhaled. "Children are not pawns. At least I would not wish them to be. But I am not naive. For now, yes, we must provide an heir. Otherwise, we both face Tywin's wrath." She studied him, her green eyes flickering. "You think you can come in here and make demands?" "I think," he murmured, "that we are caught in the same snare. The only way to loosen it is to cooperate." She pursed her lips, her gaze dropping momentarily before lifting to meet his. "I despise this," she said, "but perhaps you're right." She approached him, each step small and deliberate, until she stood mere inches away. Her voice turned softer, though not gentle. "Let us do our duty quickly, then." He placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her muscles. For a moment, they paused, looking at each other as if across a chasm. Then, almost brusquely, she reached up, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. He tasted wine on her lips, felt the press of her body. It was passion laced with anger, a raw collision of want and resentment. He reciprocated, letting the heat ignite. Somewhere in the back of his mind, He thought of how twisted this was, that he was touching the daughter of the man who orchestrated Elia's death. Yet his blood stirred, desire mingled with bitterness, and the swirl of it carried them both onto the bed, the flicker of the hearth dancing on their skin. They came together with urgency, neither tender nor wholly unkind, but propelled by a mutual frustration with the roles they had been forced to play. There was a fierce energy in Cersei, a hunger to assert control even in the midst of surrender. Oberyn matched it, though his mind flickered with memories of lovers past, free of this heavy burden of vengeance. When it was done, they lay in silence, breathing heavily, staring at the canopy overhead. The sweetness of the aftermath was marred by the knowledge that this was a duty as much as anything else. Cersei eventually rose and poured herself wine from a nearby pitcher. She drank deeply, then offered the cup to Oberyn. He took it, sipped, and handed it back without a word. The silence stretched. Finally, she spoke, her tone edged with bitterness. "Satisfied now? We did what was required." He propped himself up on one elbow. "I wonder if you truly believe that duty is all that matters." She gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Belief? I have no use for it. I know the reality. If I fail to produce a child, my father will see me as worthless. Well, I suspect you do not want to give him cause to doubt your loyalty either." She drank more wine, her features softening in the golden light. Oberyn watched her in silence. A flicker of pity stirred in him, unexpected and unwelcome. She was as trapped by Tywin as he was, in her own way, but the memory of Elia's death overshadowed any sympathy he might feel. He rose from the bed, found his clothes scattered on the floor. As he dressed, he spoke quietly. "If you conceive, let us hope the child grows up in a realm less drenched in blood than ours." She looked at him, her eyes seeming to glisten with an emotion he could not name. Then she set down the wine and turned away, letting the dressing gown slip back over her shoulders. He saw the delicate lines of her back in the firelight, a reminder that she was more than just a mask of cunning and cruelty. But he remembered the vow he had made, the unstoppable need for justice. So he left the chamber with only a curt nod, shutting the door behind him. In the following weeks, they kept up appearances, attending feasts side by side, giving the court reason to believe the marriage was now legitimate and on track to produce the next generation of Martell Lannister blood. Whispers floated that the new princess might be expecting, but it was too early to confirm. Oberyn noticed Tywin's gaze resting on them during banquets, as though evaluating whether his daughter's belly would soon swell with a child. The Lord's expression was typically inscrutable, but Oberyn sensed a grim satisfaction from him, as if the great Tywin Lannister had once more orchestrated events to secure his dynasty. Oberyn ground his teeth and played the amiable husband, even as he longed to see Tywin brought low. He spent more time in the training yard, honing his skill with the spear to a lethal point. Some knights mocked him quietly for using a peasant's weapon, but he ignored them, challenging any who dared question his prowess. He bested them all, leaving a swirl of hushed awe and resentment in his wake. Word spread that Oberyn Martell was as deadly as the rumors claimed. This pleased him. Fear was a currency in King's Landing. The more he could command, the better. Cersei's brother Jaime returned from his business with the king's retinue, a man widely known as one of the finest swordsmen in Westeros. Oberyn found Jaime's cool arrogance a match for his own temper. The Kingsguard knight cast Oberyn a pointed look when they met in the courtyard, as though marking him as an unwanted intruder into the Lannister family. But Oberyn only smiled. He knew Jaime was rumored to be entangled with his own sister. The gossip in King's Landing never ceased. Oberyn found it darkly amusing to imagine how Jaime must fume at the idea of Oberyn in Cersei's bed, even if love did not bind them. One afternoon, Jaime cornered Oberyn in the yard, where Oberyn had just finished sparring with a soldier from the Reach. "You handle that spear well," Jaime said, his voice edged with challenge. Oberyn tossed the practice spear to a page. "I have some skill, yes." Jaime's green eyes narrowed. "Should you ever wish to test that skill against me, I'd be curious to see how a Dornish prince fares against the Kingslayer." Oberyn inclined his head. One day, perhaps. He smiled a serpent's smile. But it would not be wise to risk injuring your sword hand now, would it? Jaime gave a tight grin. I think my hand would be just fine. He turned abruptly and strode away, golden cloak billowing behind him. Oberyn watched him go, feeling the tension in the air. Soon enough, that tension would snap. The entire Red Keep was a tinderbox, and every conversation was a spark. He needed only to ensure the spark served his purpose, that when the fire came, it consumed the right target. That night, Oberyn wandered through the castle's lesser-used corridors, searching for a rumored passage that might lead beneath the walls. He had always known the Red Keep was riddled with secret ways, and he wanted to know them all. With a single hooded lantern, he explored the dim corridors. The thick smell of old dust filled his nostrils. Occasionally, he heard rats scurrying across the stones, their claws tapping in the darkness. At length, he found a small door half hidden behind a tapestry. It opened onto a cramped stairwell spiraling down. He descended, heart pounding in quiet excitement. These hidden paths could be crucial for the day he sought retribution. At the foot of the stairs, a narrow tunnel snaked away, the walls damp with seepage from the distant sea. Oberyn followed it slowly. His lantern's glow revealed scratches on the walls, half-rotted crates, and in one corner, a decaying skeleton of some unfortunate soul. The stench was faint but unmistakable. He pressed on, eventually reaching an iron gate, locked from the other side. He peered through the bars and saw another corridor beyond, lit by a single torch bracket. A shape moved, and he froze, snuffing his lantern. His eyes adjusted, glimpsing a cloaked figure standing near the gate on the far side. Oberyn's pulse quickened. If this was a guard, he would have to slip away silently. But the figure made no move to speak or raise an alarm. Oberyn retreated a few steps, deciding not to risk an encounter. He was about to turn and go back the way he came, when a soft voice floated through the grate, distinctly male, though oddly muffled. "Prince Oberyn," it said. He froze. Slowly, he approached again, heart hammering. "Who goes there?" he whispered. The cloaked figure shifted, but Oberyn could not see a face. "In time, you will learn all the secrets of the Red Keep. But for now, know that you are not the only one who walks these passages at night. The city is full of watchers." A chill ran up Oberyn's spine. "Varys?" he guessed softly. A soft chuckle. "I am many things, Prince. Consider this a friendly warning. The path you tread is dangerous." Oberyn felt anger flare. "I need no warnings." "No." The figure's tone was both amused and sad. "Even the viper needs caution when facing the lion in his den. Your thirst for vengeance is no secret to those with ears in every wall." Oberyn clenched his jaw, but forced his voice to remain low. "You speak in riddles, friend. If you are friend, is there a reason you watch me from the shadows instead of aiding me openly?" A rustle of cloth as if the figure had shrugged. "Open actions are too easily seen. Some alliances are best formed in whispers. Remember this passage. You may need it one day, but be wary. The realm is not as stable as it seems." Before Oberyn could reply, the torch on the other side flickered and went out, plunging the corridor into darkness. He cursed, relighting his lantern, but by the time he raised it to the bars, the figure was gone. Only the faint echo of footsteps remained. He stood there for a long moment, unsettled. Then he turned and retraced his steps to the upper levels, determined not to let the labyrinth swallow him whole. When he emerged into a corridor near the royal kitchens, he realized his hands were trembling. He steadied himself against the wall, breathing deeply. So the Master of Whisperers, or perhaps another spymaster, knew of his nighttime wanderings, had guessed his plan for revenge. He forced himself to calm. The game had always been dangerous. He would proceed carefully, forging alliances of his own. When the time was right, he would strike, and all the watchers in King's Landing would not stop him. In the weeks that followed, Cersei revealed signs that she might indeed be with child. The court buzzed at the possibility. Tywin's stiff demeanor showed a hint of satisfaction, and messages traveled to Sunspear to inform Doran of the potential heir. Oberyn felt no rush of paternal joy, only a muted acceptance. He found it difficult to imagine fatherhood in the midst of this duplicity. Yet part of him acknowledged the innocent life that might be forming. He vowed that if a child were born, he would protect it from the worst of this vicious realm, no matter what. Cersei herself grew more guarded, if that was even possible. She refused to discuss the child with him in private, except to say that it was too early to be certain. Sometimes, though, Oberyn caught her standing at a window, one hand pressed to her abdomen, her gaze far away. Did she fear her father's manipulations? Did she sense the doom that might follow if this child were brought into a marriage built on vengeance? Oberyn had no answers. They barely spoke of personal matters. Yet one night, as they lay in bed, he had taken to sharing her chamber more often, to keep appearances. She said, almost absently, "What kind of world will this be for a son or daughter born to us? I wonder." He turned his head to regard her. "We can shape that world," he said quietly, though he was not sure if he believed it. She closed her eyes, her lashes dark against her cheeks. "You and I," she murmured, "and my father, and your brother, and all these fools in King's Landing." He brushed a strand of hair away from her face. She did not push him away. For an instant, they shared a moment of fragile, if unspoken, connection. Then the dawn light began creeping in, and with it came the realities of their situation. She rose to dress without another word, pulling on her gown as if donning armor. As the months slipped by, Oberyn found himself spinning more threads in the capital's tapestry. He befriended a few minor lords from the Stormlands, teased out their grievances with the Baratheon king's inattentiveness. He spoke quietly with certain merchants who supplied the city's luxuries, gleaning their discontent with the heavy taxes. He even visited the royal menagerie with Tommen and Myrcella, Cersei's younger siblings in this twisted timeline, studying how House Lannister maintained its hold on them. He cast seeds of doubt and dissatisfaction where he could, hoping they might bear fruit should the day of revolt ever come. Yet always Tywin loomed, unyielding. The man was cunning beyond measure, controlling the royal finances, forging alliances across the realm. Even King Robert's authority seemed overshadowed by Tywin's presence. Oberyn realized how carefully he would need to plan, how thoroughly he would need to gather allies if he meant to strike at Tywin without losing his life in the attempt. Some nights, he lay awake, imagining the blow that would finally topple the Lion of the Rock. He pictured Tywin kneeling, forced to confess his complicity in Elia's death. The fantasy both sustained and tormented him. Cersei's belly began to swell. It became undeniable that she carried his child. Whispers ran rampant. The queen's younger brother, Tyrion, offered polite congratulations, though Oberyn suspected the dwarf wondered privately whose child it might truly be. Jaime Lannister seemed more aloof than ever, his face tight with what could have been jealousy. Tywin's pride was evident, though hidden behind a veneer of stoicism. The realm looked on with interest, seeing in this unborn child the living symbol of House Martell and House Lannister joined. To Oberyn's surprise, as Cersei advanced in her pregnancy, a subtle shift occurred in her demeanor toward him. She grew quieter, less inclined to hurl barbs or sneering remarks. Occasionally, she would allow him to help her navigate stairs or settle her onto a cushioned seat without spitting some venomous aside. Oberyn was not fool enough to believe she loved him, but perhaps the child stirred some maternal softness. Or maybe it was simply her own calculations, seeing that the health of her unborn son or daughter would rely on Oberyn's support. Whatever the reason, they managed a fragile truce. One late afternoon, he found her alone in the royal gardens, seated on a marble bench beneath a fruit tree heavy with golden apples. She had a hand pressed gently to her abdomen, her gown tailored to accommodate the curve. The sun's rays filtered through the leaves, dappling her with shifting patterns of light. She looked almost serene. He approached quietly. "You seem lost in thought." She glanced up, meeting his gaze with a small, weary smile. "I am pondering the future. When I was young, I imagined my life so differently. I thought I would marry a prince, bear his children, and we would reign in glory and power." Oberyn inclined his head. And is that not what you have done? She let out a faint laugh. You are a prince, yes, and I am bearing your child. But this is not the life I envisioned. My father orchestrated this union, and I— She paused, seeming to weigh her words. I suppose I resent that loss of control. He sat beside her on the bench, inhaling the sweet scent of the apples overhead. I understand. My path here was shaped by forces outside my control as well. Yet we have both found ourselves at the center of power in King's Landing. Perhaps that can be turned to our advantage. She looked away, her gaze wandering to a bee hovering near a blossom. You speak of advantage. My father is the one who holds the reins. You and I are but horses pulling his chariot. Oberyn frowned, considering how best to respond. Horses can throw their rider, if they are willing to risk the consequences. She tilted her head, a spark of interest in her eyes. An intriguing thought. They let the conversation lapse, each lost in private reflection. Oberyn listened to the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of courtiers on the far side of the gardens. In that moment, he felt the faintest thread of empathy for Cersei, trapped by her father's ambitions, as he was by his thirst for revenge. Neither could truly break free without risking everything. Yet the child within her tied them together inescapably. He told himself that child would have Martell blood, and so it was worth protecting. He told himself it would be a tool for his plans. But a part of him whispered that it might also be a chance for him to create something beyond violence, if he dared. Before he could dwell on that further, a servant approached, bowing low. Your Graces, Lord Tywin requests your presence in the Solar. King Robert has returned from the hunt, and they are discussing matters of state. Cersei let out a slow breath, her face hardening back into its usual mask. Very well, we'll come. She stood, Oberyn offering his arm to help her rise. Together, they left the dappled light of the garden for the castle's corridors. The moment of rare intimacy vanished like a dream upon waking. Inside the Solar, Tywin stood by a table strewn with maps. Robert Baratheon slouched in a chair beside him, looking half-drunk or simply bored. Robert's heavy frame seemed out of place among Tywin's calculating presence. The king glanced up when Oberyn and Cersei entered, and he gave a grunt of acknowledgement. Ah, there you are, Robert said, scratching his beard. We've some trouble in the Stormlands near Tarth. Bandits, maybe. Lord Selwyn's complaining to the crown. Tywin's gaze barely flicked to Oberyn. We will dispatch troops, but I also want you both to be aware that tensions run high on the southern border. Some restlessness among the Dornish March Lords. Oberyn folded his arms. And you suspect House Martell's involvement? Tywin's expression was impassive. I suspect opportunists, but as my daughter's husband, I expect your help in quelling any such dissent. Cersei stood very straight, her hand discreetly on her belly. My lord father, I must wonder if traveling to the marches is wise in my current condition. Robert let out a coarse laugh. Surely not. That's a job for the men. Let the ladies rest. He reached for a cup of wine, draining it in a single gulp. Though I'd wager the prince here would prefer to keep you close. Oberyn felt a flicker of anger at Robert's careless tone, but he kept his voice level. Indeed, I will see to it that no unrest spills into Dorne. If there's trouble near Tarth, I can send some men to investigate. Tywin nodded, turning back to the map. Good. Ensure that your brother is informed. We need stability. The crown cannot afford another rebellion. Cersei said nothing, though her eyes bored into her father's back with an intensity Oberyn found telling. After some more curt instructions regarding troop deployments and taxes, Tywin dismissed them. As Oberyn escorted Cersei into the corridor, Robert waved them off, already reaching for another bottle. The presence of Tywin overshadowed everything. The man was determined to keep the realm in hand, by steel or coin or fear. Oberyn clenched his fists, yearning for the day he could tear that iron grip apart. But that day was not yet. For now, he would pretend to help maintain the king's peace. He would travel if needed, quell disturbances, and be the dutiful consort to the Lannister bride. All the while, he would keep forging alliances of shadow and rumor, building the scaffolding of a grand betrayal that would one day see Tywin's power crumble. When that moment came, he would strike swiftly, as only the Viper of Dorne could. Elia's memory demanded nothing less. He glanced at Cersei's profile as they walked, noting the tension in her jaw. Perhaps she, too, dreamed of a day when she could break free from her father's hold. Perhaps she would stand beside Oberyn, or perhaps she would stab him in the back. He could trust no one here, least of all his wife. Yet as their footsteps echoed through the torchlit corridor, he felt the unborn child between them like an unseen presence, an uncertain hope tethering their fates. He could almost hear the gods laughing, for the lines between vengeance and survival had never been so blurred. He waited until nightfall to begin the first step of his larger design. Cersei had retired early, complaining of fatigue from carrying the child. Oberyn left her chambers with a courteous nod and made his way to one of the smaller banquet halls, where a handful of lesser courtiers were still lingering. He passed among them with a casual grace, offering toasts and small talk. His target was Lord Giles Rosby, a mild-tempered man with enough coin to be relevant and enough timidity to be easily influenced. Oberyn knew that Rosby, like many lesser lords, felt both gratitude and fear toward House Lannister. That made him a prime candidate to manipulate. Oberyn steered the conversation toward the king's finances, the cost of the city's upkeep, the rumored expansions of the royal fleet. Rosby's eyes flickered with anxiety at each mention of increased levies. He admitted that many lords faced a difficult balance, to pay the hand's demands without bankrupting their own holdings. Oberyn nodded sympathetically, weaving subtle suggestions that Dorne was a safer ally for the future. No direct promises, just the faint glimmer of an alternative. After a few cups of wine, Lord Rosby was nodding along, confiding small details of coin shipments and how Tywin Lannister's collectors were becoming more aggressive in their methods. When at last Oberyn withdrew, giving Lord Rosby a friendly clasp on the shoulder, he left the man with the impression that House Martell might be a shield if Tywin's demands grew too harsh. A small seed, but seeds could sprout in the hidden corners of the court. Oberyn had learned from his travels in Essos that rebellions often began not with swords, but whispers and shifting loyalties. Over the following weeks, he continued these subtle overtures with other minor lords, particularly those who had felt the Lannister claw too deeply, promises of discreet alliances, or perhaps a gentler arrangement if ever they found themselves at odds with the hand. He did nothing overt, never formed an open coalition, but he quietly stockpiled goodwill. It was a slow and painstaking process, akin to moving pieces on a Cyvasse board where each shift had to be done under a watchful enemy eye. Meanwhile, he maintained a careful relationship with Varys. The Master of Whisperers would drift by Oberyn in corridors or corners of the throne room, offering riddles in that soft, unthreatening voice. Oberyn responded with pleasantries, never fully trusting the spider, never fully dismissing him. After all, Varys had eyes everywhere, and Oberyn wanted to ensure that if Varys ever chose sides, he might choose in favor of the Martell cause, or at least remain neutral. When pressed on his loyalties, the eunuch would smile and say only that he served the realm. Oberyn wondered if that was half the truth or a convenient lie. Cersei's belly grew. By the 7th moon of her pregnancy, she walked with more caution, her hands constantly resting on the gentle swell beneath her gown. The entire court watched her progress, taking bets on whether she would bear a boy or a girl. Tywin, ever the stoic puppet master, showed no outward sign of preference. Though Oberyn suspected the Lannister lord hoped for a grandson he could mold as the next scion. Oberyn found himself torn between a swirl of contradictory emotions. He had never married for love, had never imagined fatherhood with a Lannister. Yet each night, when he looked at Cersei dozing fitfully and thought of the child she carried, he felt something oddly protective stirring. He did not want the child to become yet another casualty of Tywin's maneuvers, nor a mere tool of Oberyn's revenge. Elia's memory flared in his mind, and he resolved that he would spare this child from the horrors that had befallen his sister's children. On a crisp morning near the end of autumn, Cersei summoned him to her solar. He found her perched on a cushioned chair, wearing a flowing dress that accommodated her advanced pregnancy. Light slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. A brazier burned gently in the corner, warding off the chill. She glanced up at his entrance and gestured for him to close the door. Her face was drawn, her eyes dark with worry. "There is something wrong?" he asked, stepping closer. She drew in a breath, her hands clasped over her stomach. "I am not sure yet. The maester says the child seems healthy, but I have had dreams. Strange dreams of blood and betrayal." Oberyn arched a brow. "Many in this place dream of blood. It is the curse of King's Landing." She looked away, her gaze settling on a tapestry that depicted a long-ago victory for House Targaryen. "I fear my father will see this child as another Lannister piece. And I know you harbor your own reasons for being here. I am caught between them. Perhaps this child will be pulled in two directions." He approached carefully. "And you believe I would tear our child away from you?" Her jaw tightened. "I do not know. I only know that if the babe is a boy, my father will expect him to be raised as a Lannister, taught to despise any threat to the Rock. If it is a girl, well, that might be simpler for him to control. He will marry her off as he sees fit." She let out a bitter laugh. "I have been used as a bargaining chip all my life. I do not want my child to share that fate." Oberyn knelt beside her chair, resting a hand lightly on her arm. He felt the tension thrumming through her. "I cannot speak for Tywin, but I promise you this. I will not let him harm our child or shape it into something unrecognizable. Perhaps you and I are not bound by love, but we are bound by necessity and by this child's future." She studied his face for a long moment, her eyes flicking over the lines of his brow, the shape of his mouth, as if searching for deception. Then she exhaled. "I will hold you to that promise, Prince Oberyn." He inclined his head. "Then let us consider how we might protect what is ours from your father's schemes." Her lips curved, a faint, almost conspiratorial smile ghosting over them. "I have ideas of my own, and I suspect you have many. Perhaps together, we can keep our child out of Tywin's claws, and in so doing shape the realm differently." A strange hush fell between them, some new understanding forming in the still air. Oberyn recognized in Cersei a thirst for independence that mirrored his thirst for vengeance. For a moment, he let himself believe they might find common cause, that she might aid him in toppling the man who had orchestrated Elia's murder. Yet a quiet voice inside him warned that Cersei's loyalties were fickle. Still, the possibility of an alliance, however fragile, glimmered. In the days that followed, they spoke more frequently, behind closed doors. Their conversations tiptoed around the real subject, Tywin Lannister's eventual downfall, but each insinuation felt like a stepping stone. Oberyn confided to her some of Dorne's frustrations with the crown, how the southern lords chafed under a reign that disregarded their old alliances. Cersei, in turn, hinted at dissatisfaction among certain Westerland's bannermen who felt overshadowed by the Tywin juggernaut. She never openly said she wished her father harm. That would have been too dangerous, even for her. But the meaning was there in the hush of the solar, the flicker of candlelight on her face. Meanwhile, Oberyn quietly spread more seeds in the shadows. He found small ways to undermine Tywin's authority. Delayed shipments to Lannister garrisons, shipments that would conveniently arrive late or short of supplies, hushed letters to Doran indicating that certain trade routes might need adjustments. He fostered discontent among the lesser lords, reminding them that a single man should not hold the entire kingdom in thrall. He ensured that those who had grievances against Tywin found sympathetic ears in certain corners of the capital. And inch by inch, Oberyn built a subtle network of watchers and informants, ready for the moment the old lion stumbled. Amid all this, the king, Robert Baratheon, grew increasingly distant, indulging in hunts and feasts, leaving the actual governance to Tywin and the small council. Rumors circulated that Robert had fathered multiple bastards in the city, that he hardly spent a day sober. Oberyn observed him at feasts, slumping in his seat, bellowing for more wine, sometimes throwing lazy insults at lords who displeased him. The realm was, in truth, led by Tywin, even if Robert wore the crown. That only deepened Oberyn's resolve. If Tywin were removed, everything else might shift. It was a gamble on a grand scale, but one Oberyn was willing to take. As winter's edge approached, Cersei went into labor. It happened at night, her groans and cries waking half the Red Keep. Oberyn rushed to her chambers, where Maester Pycelle and several midwives had gathered. The corridor was lined with anxious courtiers, some praying, some gossiping. Tywin was there as well, his face set in a mask. Oberyn saw the flicker of tension in Tywin's eyes. This was the moment that could change the entire direction of House Lannister's future. Time stretched painfully. Oberyn paced outside the bedchamber, hearing Cersei's muffled screams from within, the maester's soothing admonitions. Finally, the door opened, and a flushed midwife emerged, beckoning Oberyn in. He entered to see Cersei propped against pillows, hair matted with sweat, her face pale but alive with a strange, fierce light. In her arms rested a squalling bundle wrapped in linen. Pycelle hovered nearby, fussing, while a servant wiped blood from the sheets. Oberyn approached slowly, his heart drumming. Cersei peeled back the cloth, revealing a small, red-faced infant, flailing tiny fists. The child had a dusting of dark hair and a healthy set of lungs. "A boy," the maester declared, strong in voice. "He will thrive, my prince." Oberyn gently touched the baby's cheek, still uncertain how to feel. He saw none of the Lannister gold in that newborn hair, at least not yet. But he thought of Elia's children, how they had once been just as small, just as fragile. His throat tightened. Cersei looked at him, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. Then she gave a faint smile, lifting the baby toward him. "Your son," she whispered. He took the child in his arms. The baby let out an indignant wail, then quieted. Oberyn's chest felt tight, as though some hidden gate had opened inside him. He bent his head, pressing a light kiss to the baby's forehead. "My son," he repeated softly. In that moment, he forgot the complexities of revenge, forgot Tywin, forgot the swirling hatred that had driven him for years. There was only this child, warm and alive against his chest. Tywin entered, stoic as ever, but Oberyn saw a flash of emotion in the older man's gaze when he beheld the boy. The Lord of Casterly Rock nodded to Oberyn, then bent over the bed, pressing a brief kiss to Cersei's brow. "You have done well," he said, as though praising a soldier for a strategic victory. "He will be a credit to both House Lannister and House Martell." Cersei closed her eyes, her face lined with relief. Oberyn gently returned the baby to her arms. Outside, the hush in the corridor exploded into a flurry of exclamations as news spread. A new prince was born, a child of Lannister and Martell, bridging old hatreds, or so the city would claim. Many would hope this signaled a lasting peace. But Oberyn knew that behind every lull in the storm, lightning still flickered. The next weeks were a haze of celebration and recovery. Nobles flocked to see the newborn. Tywin named the child Mors, after one of the ancient ancestors who had first united parts of Dorne with Westeros. Oberyn found the choice of name ironic. Mors Martell had been cunning and merciless in his day, but he did not argue. He was too preoccupied ensuring that Cersei and the child were well, and that Tywin did not use the birth as an excuse to muzzle Oberyn's quiet maneuverings. If anything, the old lion seemed momentarily softened by the presence of his grandson. He arranged for lavish gifts: a golden cradle emblazoned with both the lion and the sun spear, fine silks for the child's bedding, a small menagerie of carved wooden animals. The court cooed and congratulated him. Meanwhile, Oberyn sensed no lessening of Tywin's vigilance. He might be a proud grandsire, but that did not mean he would let his grip on power falter. On the contrary, a grandson only strengthened his desire to secure the family legacy. During this time, Jaime Lannister visited the nursery frequently, staring at the infant with an expression Oberyn could not interpret. Tyrion arrived as well, bringing a small stuffed lion and an offhand joke that the baby would face quite a heritage. Cersei took these visits with composure, though Oberyn sensed a tension in her that she tried to hide. Perhaps she worried about her twins' disapproval, or that rumors might swirl over the child's parentage. If so, she never spoke of it openly. She spent her days in bed or in a cushioned chair, recovering, letting the maids fawn over little Moors. Sometimes, Oberyn caught her watching him with the baby, her gaze contemplative, as though trying to decide whether she could trust him with the child's future. One afternoon, not long after Moors turned a month old, Oberyn was summoned to Tywin's Solar. He arrived to find the Lord seated at a desk strewn with letters. A single brazier cast a warm glow over the polished wood, and a slight odor of sealing wax filled the room. Tywin looked up, his face revealing nothing. He gestured to a chair. "Sit," he commanded. Oberyn did so, mindful of the tension in the air. Tywin pushed a parchment across the desk. "I've received news from my contacts in the Westerlands. There's unrest brewing near the Blackwater Rush. Our bannermen speak of brigands who may be encroaching from the Reach. But more disturbingly, rumors claim they are flying a red sun and spear on their shields." Oberyn feigned surprise, though his heartbeat quickened. "That is House Martell's sigil, or a close imitation." "Yes," Tywin said coldly, "and I would like to know if this is some scheme by Dorne to test my defenses." Oberyn let a hint of anger show. "Are you accusing me of sending raiders into the Westerlands? That would be both foolish and dishonorable. I have no knowledge of these supposed brigands." Tywin's green eyes bored into him. "Perhaps not you personally, but your family or your allies." House Martell was none too pleased about the terms forced upon it after the war. "You must understand that I will not allow such provocations to go unanswered." Oberyn exhaled, letting his posture relax. "I will write to Doran. He will investigate. If these raiders bear a Dornish banner without our consent, we will punish them ourselves." Tywin studied him in silence, his gaze measuring. "I expect a swift resolution. I will not have men claiming Martell colors plundering my lands." Oberyn nodded, inwardly seething at the man's arrogance. The possibility that Tywin himself had orchestrated this rumor, fabricating an excuse to tighten his hold, was very real. But Oberyn kept his face calm. "I share your desire for peace. After all, my son is as much a Lannister as a Martell. I would not undermine the legacy I have helped create." Tywin's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gave a curt nod. "See that you do not." When Oberyn left the Solar, he found his hands clenched into fists. The memory of Elia's final hours pushed to the forefront of his mind. Tywin's veiled threats still stung. If the old lion thought to use these rumored raiders as a pretext to clamp down on Dorne, Oberyn would have to be prepared. He scowled, heading toward the nursery to find some momentary solace with his son. But as he entered the nursery, he encountered Cersei sitting by the cradle, rocking Moors gently. She glanced up, saw the anger in Oberyn's face, and motioned for the maids to leave. When they were alone, she spoke softly, not wishing to wake the child. "Something has happened. You look like a man about to draw steel." He approached the cradle, gazing at the tiny form of his sleeping son. The baby's soft breaths were a reminder of innocence, fragile and fleeting in this den of lions. "Your father accuses Dorne of sending brigands. It may be a ploy. He demands I quell it." She let out a quiet sigh, passing a hand over the infant's brow. "He is tightening the noose. My father sees enemies everywhere, or he creates them if they do not appear on their own." Oberyn rested a hand on Cersei's shoulder. "I will not let him strike at Dorne. If he does, there will be blood." She leaned toward him slightly, her voice a hushed murmur. "We must tread carefully. He's testing you, seeing if you will buckle or lash out. Either way, he wins, unless we find a third path." His heart thudded. "And what third path do you propose?" She closed her eyes, her lashes trembling. "If we can gather enough leverage, enough proof of his misdeeds, to ruin his standing with the king, or with the realm at large, we might bring him down without open war. But we must be cunning. My father is no fool." Oberyn considered the myriad rumors swirling about Tywin Lannister's brutal methods over the years. The sacking of King's Landing, the devastation of the reigns of Castamere, the exploitation of the royal treasury. If they could prove something damning enough, Robert might be forced to act, or at least the lords might rise against Tywin. Oberyn thought of the seeds he'd planted, the quiet network of disgruntled lords who hated Tywin. Perhaps, with Cersei's cooperation, they could unearth a scandal so large it would tear Tywin's veneer of invincibility apart. He glanced at her, seeing the lines of determination on her face. "Are you truly ready to move against your father?" he asked softly. She did not flinch. "He has controlled me my entire life. He took my children's rightful inheritance." She caught herself, voice twisting. "He would see me a pawn forever. I will not let that be my child's fate." Oberyn nodded slowly. "Then we move carefully. We gather evidence. We ensure that when we strike, it is a blow that cripples him completely." Their plan took shape over many clandestine conversations. Cersei knew well the far reaches of Tywin's political dealings, the bribes and forced marriages he had orchestrated, the money he had funneled into private endeavors. She guided Oberyn toward hidden ledgers that might reveal questionable dealings, payments to mercenary companies, hush money to certain noble houses. Meanwhile, Oberyn reached out to his network, verifying each lead, collecting scraps of proof. Varys grew more interested in Oberyn's comings and goings, but Oberyn took care never to reveal too much. Tyrion occasionally raised a brow at the closeness between Oberyn and Cersei, but said nothing outright. As their evidence mounted, Oberyn felt a mixture of exhilaration and dread. If they failed, Tywin would know who had conspired against him, and the retribution would be swift. But if they succeeded, Oberyn might finally see justice for Elia. He pictured Tywin stripped of power, forced to face a royal tribunal for crimes committed during the sack of King's Landing. Possibly exiled or even executed, though that might be too grand a dream. Still, the possibility drove him on. One evening, Cersei arranged for her father's steward, a man named Miles, to be called away on a trivial errand, leaving Tywin's private study unguarded. Oberyn slipped in under cover of darkness. He lit no lamp, relying on the faint moonlight from the narrow window. Quickly, he rummaged through the locked drawers, using a slender dagger to lift latches. He found parchment after parchment, records of coin shipments from Casterly Rock, details of bribery to local lords. Some were innocuous enough, others hinted at deep corruption. He took the most damning ones, tucking them into his cloak, careful to leave the rest undisturbed. Any sign of ransacking would alert Tywin. By the time he exited, his pulse hammered in his ears, but he had what he needed. He brought the documents to Cersei's chamber. She stood by the fireplace, wearing a black robe, her long hair loose around her shoulders. Mors was asleep in the adjacent room, under a maid's watchful eye. She took the parchments, her eyes scanning the contents. By the flickering firelight, Oberyn saw the cold satisfaction that crept across her face. "Enough to ruin him," she whispered. "He siphons from the royal treasury, funneling gold into private war funds. He has forcibly seized shipments from certain bannermen, blaming bandits. Once Robert sees this, once the realm sees this, my father's power will be shattered." Oberyn's breath caught. Will Robert do anything, though? He is lazy on the throne, and Tywin is his hand. We must ensure Robert cannot ignore it. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw a glint of the same cunning that Tywin wielded. The key is not Robert alone, but the other great houses. The Starks, the Tullys, the Arryns. If they learn that Tywin illegally took gold from the crown, or misused funds meant for them, they will clamor for his removal. The realm's opinion will force Robert's hand, no matter how much he might prefer to drink and hunt. He took the documents back from her, sliding them into a leather folder. We must be certain to distribute them widely, all at once, so he cannot silence every voice or bribe them away. She nodded. Agreed. We will need allies in the Red Keep, people who can slip these copies to the right lords at the right time. The next gathering of the small council is in 3 days. We can present the evidence then, and ensure others see it simultaneously. He gently touched her cheek, feeling the warmth of the fire on her skin. Once we expose him, your father may lash out violently. Are you prepared for that? She inhaled shakily. I must be. For our son's sake, for my own. And you have your sister's memory, do you not? I do, he said softly. I have carried it all these years. Their gazes locked. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A fleeting sense of unity, born of desperation and ambition alike. Then, with a curt nod, they set about finalizing the details. The next 3 days felt like the slow tightening of a bowstring. Oberyn carefully made copies of the incriminating documents, trusting only 2 people to assist him, each under the impression that they were simply copying financial records for the crown. He spread the letters around, hidden in compartments throughout his chambers, a precaution should Tywin discover one cache. Cersei managed to speak with a few lords privately, ensuring they would attend the small council meeting. She gave them hints of a startling revelation about the hand. Meanwhile, Tywin carried on as usual, unaware that a storm was brewing around him. Each time Oberyn passed him in a corridor, the older man nodded in chilly acknowledgement, reminding Oberyn of the lethal game they played. At last, the morning of the small council meeting arrived. Cersei kissed baby Mors goodbye, telling the nurse to keep him safe and out of sight for the day. Oberyn armed himself discreetly, sliding a slender dagger into his boot. In the conference chamber, Robert Baratheon lounged at the head of the table, yawning as the council members filed in. Pycelle, Varys, Littlefinger, Stannis Baratheon, and Tywin himself. Cersei took a seat off to the side, as was permitted for royal family members. Oberyn positioned himself behind her chair. The air felt thick. They began with mundane matters. Shipments from the Vale, a new trade route proposed by the Ironborn, which Stannis denounced. Tywin remained stoic, dispensing instructions. Oberyn watched him closely, waiting for Cersei's signal. Finally, she cleared her throat, a sound that caused all eyes to turn her way. "My lords," she said, her voice crisp but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I bring concerns about the realm's finances. Certain documents have come to my attention that cast grave doubts on our current usage of crown gold." Tywin's brow furrowed, though he remained silent for the moment. Robert gave a lazy wave. "Speak up, Cersei. What's amiss now?" She glanced at Oberyn. He stepped forward, placing a leather folder on the table. "These," he said, flicking it open, "are records showing that Lord Tywin has directed significant sums of gold away from the crown's treasury to private war funds and to forcibly quash certain lords who might speak against him. Some shipments attributed to bandit raids were, in fact, seized under Tywin's orders." A stunned hush fell. Tywin's expression was thunderous, though he schooled it quickly. Littlefinger leaned over the table, scanning the pages with swift, practiced eyes. Stannis's mouth tightened as he read, clearly enraged by any hint of corruption. Varys stood still, hands folded, a faint frown on his plump face. Pycelle paled, adjusting his chain. Even Robert seemed taken aback. Tywin finally spoke, his voice sharp. "This is absurd. Forgeries, obviously. My daughter and her Dornish husband have fabricated lies to sully my reputation." Cersei's gaze never wavered. "I have verified them. The accounts match shipments that disappeared from the royal coffers. And Lord Baelish can confirm the numeric discrepancies. Can he not?" Littlefinger's lips curved slightly, though his eyes remained alert. "I have noticed irregularities," he murmured. "Indeed, there appears to be some truth to these documents, and I see the seal of the hand on several lines." Tywin's face tightened further. Those seals could be forged by any halfway competent scribe. Stannis rose from his seat, fists clenched. "If this is true, it's treason against the crown. The gold belongs to the king, not to you, Lannister. Unless you can offer an explanation that satisfies us." Robert slammed a hand on the table, the impact rattling the parchments. "By the gods, Tywin, if you've been cheating the crown, I'll have your head on a spike." His rage carried a slur of old animosity. Perhaps he resented Tywin's overshadowing presence. Tywin drew himself up. "Your Grace, I have served the realm tirelessly. These charges are baseless. Let me examine the documents fully. But it was too late. Oberyn could see the council's mood shifting. Stannis demanded a full investigation. Littlefinger slyly spoke of urgent reforms. Pycelle, flustered, tried to defend Tywin, but the paper trail was too damning. Whispers spread among the guards stationed at the walls, the attendants standing by. Word would flow through King's Landing like wildfire. Cersei had orchestrated exactly what was needed. A public, humiliating revelation that the Hand might be stealing from the realm. Robert eyed Tywin with open suspicion, perhaps relishing the chance to knock the proud lion down. Until this matter is resolved, Tywin, I'm stripping you of the Hand's badge, he declared. I won't have a damned thief controlling my coin. Ser Barristan, place Lord Tywin under guard. Tywin's eyes blazed with hatred, turning on Oberyn and Cersei as if he might tear them apart. But he had no immediate recourse. The Kingsguard moved in, Jaime among them, face-stricken. Jaime hesitated, looking between his father and the king, but Robert barked, "Do it, Kingslayer!" With a tortured grimace, Jaime stepped forward, removing the golden hand's pin from Tywin's collar. The old lion stood rigid, his breath coming hard. "You will regret this," Tywin said, voice dangerously low. "You have no idea what you have unleashed." Oberyn felt his heart pounding, a surge of triumph mixed with caution. This was not over. Tywin was too formidable to simply succumb without a fight. But the first blow had been struck. After so many years, Oberyn could almost hear Elia's voice rejoicing in his mind. He had pulled Tywin from his seat of unchecked power. Outside the council chambers, a roar of speculation grew, courtiers rushing about to learn details. Cersei's face was taut as she stood, but Oberyn saw fierce satisfaction behind her eyes. She took a step closer to her father, lowering her voice so only Oberyn, Tywin, and the few near them could hear. "You made me your pawn," she said. "You forced me to your will. No more, father. Your era is done." Tywin bared his teeth, looking for an instant like a cornered beast. "I still have allies beyond these walls. Do you think you can hold me like a criminal? This is folly." Robert, swaying slightly from half-drunken anger, waved a dismissive hand. "Take him to his quarters and keep him there under guard until I decide what's to be done. Then we'll have a proper trial or hearing. I've no patience for his threats." The Kingsguard seized Tywin's arms. Jaime bristled but stood aside as they escorted the old lord away. Tywin's final glare at Oberyn brimmed with lethal promise. He would not go quietly into disgrace. The tension crackled in the air even after he was gone. Stannis and Littlefinger began sorting through the financial ledgers at once, pressing Maester Pycelle for more answers. Varys hovered near Robert, whispering something with that soft, unctuous smile. Oberyn escorted Cersei from the chamber, her steps unsteady. When they reached a side corridor, she sagged against the wall, breathing as though she had run a race. "It's done," she said, voice trembling. Oberyn placed a hand on her shoulder. "The first step. Tywin still breathes, and he will not yield easily. We must be prepared for his counterstroke." She closed her eyes. "Let him rot under guard. He can do nothing. Once the lords see this evidence, they'll clamor for him to be stripped of titles, perhaps even tried for treason. The king will have no choice." Oberyn gazed at her, recalling all the nights he had dreamed of exacting some violent, personal revenge on Tywin. But now, as he imagined the old lion locked in his rooms, dignity shattered, he felt a cold sense of justice. Not quite enough for Elia's ghost, but a start. He slid his arm around Cersei's waist, guiding her toward the royal apartments. "Let us secure our son. Tywin might still have loyal men who would do anything to free him or strike back." She nodded, leaning on him. For an instant, they presented the semblance of a united couple, forging a new path through the labyrinth. The corridor's torches flickered, casting wavering shadows. Outside, the day was bright, but inside these walls, schemes and secrets thrived. Oberyn wondered if the downfall of Tywin Lannister would truly bring him peace, or if it would unleash new chaos upon the realm. The game was never simple, but for now, one truth shone clear. The man who had orchestrated Elia's murder no longer sat in a seat of power, and Oberyn had helped cast him down. They pressed on, step by step, uncertain of what battles might arise next, but determined to face them with eyes wide open. The child they had created lay waiting in the nursery, symbolic of a tenuous future. Martell and Lannister blood intertwined, bridging a rift that once seemed unbridgeable. Oberyn knew that whether he ultimately claimed his perfect vengeance or not, everything in the Seven Kingdoms had shifted. The shadow of Tywin's invincibility had cracked, and within that crack, Oberyn would see justice done. Elia's face lingered at the edge of his thoughts, and he whispered her name under his breath, as though calling her to witness this turning of the tide. Outside, the bells of the Red Keep began to toll, summoning all to hear the news. The hand of the king had fallen under suspicion of treason. Lords and ladies paused in the courtyards, gold cloaks exchanged puzzled glances, and rumors took flight on every tongue. Oberyn and Cersei continued on, hearts pounding. The realm was about to change, for better or worse, and in the center of it all stood a Dornish prince who had wed a lioness to avenge his sister from within the Red Keep. He had opened the lion's den and found, to his surprise, that sometimes even the proudest beasts could be undone with the right combination of cunning and steel. He placed his hand gently over Cersei's, where it rested on her hip. Together, they turned the corner toward the nursery. The corridor stretched before them, lit by bright sunlight slanting through the windows, a path toward whatever future they might shape. And behind them lay the echo of Tywin's furious roar, an old lion caged at last, the fate of the realm trembling on the brink of a new age.